has recreational and aesthetic value to residents. But critics have really pointed out that these kind of fundamental changes that turf grass creates alter ecological structure and function, including causing habitat fragmentation, obviously, and increased chemical inputs, as well as their water demand. Now, an untested but apparent, functionally untested result of urban land use change is homogenization across cities. We have a sense that neighborhoods such as Boston and Phoenix across different parts of the country have similar, they do have similar patterns of roads, as you can see, residential lots, commercial areas, and aquatic features, right? You and I can go to a Home Depot, a Pottery Barn, a McDonald's, and have the exact same experience, and structurally the same experience in the entire country. So for this project, we hypothesized that this homogenization not only is social cultural, but it also affects ecological structure and function relative to ecosystem carbon and nitrogen dynamics that have continental scale implications. So you're right, that's Boston on the left there. To try to figure out these questions about homogenizations and these hypotheses we have about continental scale change, what we're doing is conducting both social and ecological research in 6 major metropolitan areas in the United States. These represent very different kind of climatic regions. These areas are Phoenix, Miami, Baltimore, Boston, the St. Paul area, as well as in Los Angeles. And we're doing this to discover how household characteristics will correlate with landscaping decisions, land management practices, and ecological structure and function at local, regional, as well as at continental scales. So the experimental design, as you can imagine, for this project with these many cities is extremely complex, and I'm not even going to go into it all right now, but I can answer questions later. But basically, at each city site, we're conducting very intensive sampling of social and ecological variables at 30 different households. And these households represent at least 5 different kinds of neighborhoods in each city that have similar kind of lifestyle classifications. And these lifestyle classifications are a way of looking at census data to tell something about class and stage of life, basically. So briefly, what we're doing is conducting what our methods range from here are household surveys, which is what I've been in charge of, to soil and vegetation sampling at the regional scale, and then we're using remote sensing data across these 6 areas to kind of have a broader scale look at change. So for my part of the project and what I'll be talking about here is that I led the development of the homeowner interview protocols along with colleagues Kelly Larson at ASU, Kristen Nelson at Minnesota, and Rinku Roy-Chowdhury, who's an FCE collaborator who's at Indiana. And what we did is we developed these standardized interview techniques for the 6 different cities. We translated them into Spanish, and I trained all the research teams at all 6 cities. So what I'm going to do now is report on some of the preliminary findings from our summer fieldwork here in Miami. That's almost finished. We have a little bit more to go, and Lawrence, we're so lucky, Lopez, who's here today, is really taking the lead on lots of the fieldwork. We're very grateful for him for doing that. This research also overlaps, as I said, with some FCE research, which I'm going to bring down. So this is a photograph of Miami. You all recognize that. The Miami that we saw in our field work was very different, especially from the vantage point of crawling around on people's yards on our hands and knees for 10 hours per household and identifying all the lawn species that they had. I'll talk about more of that in a second. It's also different because we were in a wide variety of kinds of neighborhoods in Miami. What's important as I move forward is that when I say the word Miami, this is actually a way for me to really talk about we did work in the Tri-County area. I'm using Miami as shorthand here. But so in other words, we interviewed and collected data, other kinds of biophysical data sampling in Miami, Homestead, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, and in these less incorporated areas that are the suburbs that connect all these cities. We tried very hard when we developed our sample to make sure that we accounted for the diversity of the city, particularly the Spanish-speaking communities in the city. Lawrence was really great at helping us reach out and talk to on my phone with people in Miami to help us do that, explain the project. Other members of the research team included Stephen Hodges, who worked as a botanist, and we had several undergraduates on the project as well. Jim Heffernan at Duke University and his postdoc worked with us to coordinate the soil sampling data and also broader kind of project coordination. So as I suggested, we did a lot of different kind of intensive sampling, and we sort of thought that it would be the social science group would be doing some work and the botany people would be doing other. But as it turns out, it's very fluid, and we all sort of did stuff together. So I learned an enormous amount about urban botany, and the people who are working on the botanists on the team, actually I trained to do some of the interviewing, and it really worked. This is the first time I've ever been on a research project that has been so interdisciplinary and collaborative. What we did at each of the households is that we actually had to identify and collect samples of every plant species in the yard, every single one, from every lawn weed all the way up to leaf samples from the trees. And we also collected additional data from the trees to estimate above ground biomass and primary production. As you can see, we did these formal interviews that take about an hour with homeowners inside, but we also found that when the homeowners came outside, such as in this picture here, we learned an enormous amount where our botany group were engaging with them. They would help us identify certain kinds of cultivars that we weren't able to know. But moreover, they were able to tell us about where these plants came from. Did they plant them themselves? Did a neighbor give them to them? Why did they plant them? Why was it important? And where, if they did, where they purchased their plants, which really helped us get a sense of the broader kind of political economy of urban ecology. I'm going to talk about two kinds of data now that I think you'll find interesting. Now, one of the concerns about urbanization is that it involves the homogenization of plant species, or so the reduction often of species diversity. So in other words, do cities reduce species diversity, and if so, at what scale? Moreover, do they create less diversity regionally, and do they do so in different cities? You and I, we go to Home Depot to buy our whatever, and we think to ourselves, look here, everything's an Arbicola or whatever, and this is what's happening in all cities. Well, we're not sure about that, and I think this project's going to shed a little light on that issue. So this home here is a typical home in a gated community in southern Florida. We've all seen this. And it reflects, I think, most of our assumptions about the transformation of non-developed lands and habitats to residential land uses. This is actually a home in Lake Worth, which is in Palm Beach County. It's a predominantly white, upper middle class neighborhood. After this project, you could just look at that house and know it was a predominantly white, upper middle class house. This house looks very similar to other houses in the neighborhood, and much of the yard was installed when the family bought the house. There's a stay-at-home mom at this house who does very minimal yard work. She planted actually a rose and some basil plants. That was the extent of her interaction with her yard. The yard is maintained by a landscaper. And like lots of neighborhoods like this, there are very strict homeowner rules about what you can and cannot do in your yard. The size of your shrubs, what kind of hedges you can put in, even the height of your lawn. This is interesting because it tells us something about the institutional politics of urban ecology. According to our IRC, South Florida is one of the most biologically diverse regions in North America with 1,400 species of native plants. The total number of species that we found in our survey in all the yards was 1,500. And it's going to go up a little bit higher because we haven't finished analyzing the data on the last few houses. In the wild, that sounds like a lot, 1,500 species, but in the wild, in terms of native and naturalized species here in South Florida, there's about 2,200. And many of these naturalized species obviously are found in places like in the Everglades and habitats like that. So what our preliminary findings are suggesting, first finding, is that there's probably less species diversity in our urban yards than occur in these habitats that they replace in the kind of complex mosaic. So urbanization is certainly creating patterns of what I would call simplification. And these patterns, though, turn out to be much more complicated when we look more closely at species information or cultivar information data, as well as if we look at the data at the parcel or household scale. So for instance, some households have a disproportionately high level of species diversity. There's Stephen with a homeowner here, and Stephen calls these people plant nuts, and I think we could probably all raise our hands. There's lots of us plant nuts here. But what these plant nuts do is that they really skew the sample. So what we know, if we take out the plant nuts, that the species diversity is much, much lower in urban spaces here in Miami. And this photo really exemplifies a kind of one of the sort of plant nuts, we could call it, just between you and me. And in this case, I say that with love as a plant nut. This is a man who's a Florida native. He is living in a house he grew up in. When he was growing up, he started his first job was at a nursery down the street from where he lives in Palm Beach County. He then went off to ag school in Gainesville. As an adult, he taught agriculture at a junior high school before he retired. And the kind of plant that this guy is a hibiscus plant nut. He's a prize-winning hibiscus breeder. And in his yard, in his single yard, he had over 200 species of plants. And about 75% of those 200 species of plants were ones that he intentionally cultivated. So they were things that were there already. What this means is that urbanization creates profound patterns of vegetation simplification in Miami when the data is more so than when you aggregate the data. And that these kind of simplified landscapes, though, are punctuated by these oases of species diversity in kind of like hotspots, if we wanted to borrow the language of biodiversity conservation. And so, but what's also interesting is these species hotspots are come into being in very particular ways. And so this species hotspot is a hotspot of hibiscus primarily, which is not something we would expect particularly. So the message here is that where we do find species diversity within the landscape of the city, it usually has its kind of unique sort of social characteristics to it. What's also really interesting, I've been talking about plants that we find at the parcel scale. Parcel's another word for talking about people's yards. But actually, one of the more interesting things from our findings has been the ways in which front yards and backyards are very, very different socio-ecological landscapes. There's been a lot of work in the social sciences. People are interested in environmental social science about how people have very different environmental values when it comes to their front and backyards. So for instance, Kelly Larson in Phoenix has showed how households who value water conservation in Phoenix, in the urban landscape obviously, in their front yards they will utilize xeriscaping and low water sort of planting, but in their backyards these same families will have green turf grass lawns, and they do so because the lawn is a kind of extension, literally or metaphorically, of their carpet in their house. And it's the landscape in the back. People want to have their kids play, they think their pets like the grass better, and so the back is a very different kind of space. We might understand, I think, front yards as the kind of public face of people's yards. And that's the place that really reflects the kind of social norms generally about class and expectations of each household. So for instance, that's why in Phoenix people have xeriscaping in the front yard. They want to look like they're, because they are. They're environmentally conscious and water conscious. And we found a similar thing going on here in Miami. Last year, as part of FCE project, my student Rebecca Garville, she interviewed residents in gated communities in South Dade, And what she found out, it's quite striking, is that for them, front yard landscaping is a way of maintaining housing values, particularly, and implicitly, and sometimes explicitly, it's a way of performing social class. So for instance, in one interview, a woman told Rebecca, when they were talking about how rigid their homeowner rules are about what to do with yard, she says, quote, neighborhoods like this keep people from having broken down cars, toilet planters, or gnomes. But there's a price to pay. You have to follow the rules, which can be annoying, but it's a trade-off because of the safety. You know, there's been some work in ecology about gated communities. There's this fabulous book by this woman who's an anthropologist in New York called about gated communities, named Setha Low. And what she shows really brilliantly in her interviews with gated community people is that discussions about safety, people always talk about wanting to live in gated communities because they're safer, they make them feel safer, but generally what they really mean, it's another way of talking about their anxieties that have to do with different economic difference, racial difference, and ethnic difference. So not all front yards that we found in our project embody these kind of middle class and upper middle class values. And instead, what front yards do is they really reflect the cultural and class positioning of residents regardless, and the ideas about in the neighborhood. So, you know, in Little Haiti and Miami, it's really common to have paved over front yards, right? And it's really common to have plastic flowers and planters that replace living plants. On the other hand, what's super interesting is that the backyard is just a place of total domestic chaos. Even in the most fancy gated communities, the backyard is a really different kind of social and lived space. And that's because the backyard is really an extension of whatever household's individual and kind of family identity. And it is an extension of this domestic space, as they found in Phoenix. I like to think about it, anthropologists often talk about the public-private dichotomy when they talk about how the world is different and how places in the world are different. And they talk about the public place is often gendered. It's kind of a male place in lots of where you make war and grow food and stuff in most parts of the world. Well, the private is this domestic space. This is not the case with what's going on in Miami Yards, but it is a kind of public-private dichotomy where the backyard really is this private space. It's not necessarily gendered. But the backyard is a place where domestic life is performed for most people. It's enacted, and in the process, it's made visible in their landscape plans. So this is a great example. This is a lower middle class neighborhood in West Palm Beach. The family is a stay-at-home mom, and she's got 3 kids. She's got a house just like all of us, where laundry baskets are piled up everywhere, dogs are running around, it's crazy. And in the back, and her husband works at a tech company, so they don't make a ton of money. But what you can see, the front yard, it's not perfect like you'd find in a gated community, but it really is very orderly. The shrubs are all the same size, it's kind of symmetrical. It embodies these kind of neighborhood sort of expectations about what is nice and what is presentable and how to make the front yard look nice. But you know, it's clear too that they don't have a landscaping company because their yard grass has dark spots in it and it's not perfect, it's kind of weedy. On the other hand, the backyard, that's the picture of the backyard, it's fairly chaotic. The woman who's in charge of the yard work in the yard there, she really did very little maintenance in her backyard at all. It's hard to, that's her pool, and we couldn't even walk through most of it, and it wasn't this kind of, we want a hammock in our yard, like some of us have, but instead it was just more like, this is too much for me and I can't do it. And what her main goal for planting things in her yard, and she had an enormous amount of species in her yard and numbers of plants, was just randomly creating these walls to buffer her yard from her neighbors. So for her, the plants were about creating privacy, and it was clear in our conversation that was the primary motivation for her neighbors to install plants as well. You know, what's interesting to me about this as we look over the data is that if we dig a little deeper, it sort of asks the question, you know, maybe homogenization is really just a front yard deal and not a backyard thing. And we might want to think about that a little bit more. So another thing we looked at is about cultivated plants, deciding and characterizing which plants were cultivated, or in other words, intentionally installed by people in their yards. It tells us a lot about what people desire, right, if you put the plants in yourself. And so we actually, as we collected plant species and documented plant species, we would indicate if it was cultivated or if it was there. And we also, whether it was an invasive or native plant. And we also made note of where in the yard it was the plant in the front yard or the backyard? Was it in a bed or was it in the turf grass, etc. What this chart shows here is that the total number of species we found in people's front and backyards compared. So you see this higher species diversity in the backyard. It also shows where we found those in the front and the backyard, whether they were in beds or were they just the total cultivated period. So you can that's what that shows. Cultivated plants, as I said, show intentionality of homeowners as well as the intentionality in many cases of home builders. And what's interesting about that is what happens when people buy their homes, they're already landscaped. And generally speaking, there's a lot of conflict going on in people's yards between the kind of plants that builders install, usually these hedges right along the front of the house, or hedges around the side of the house. As you can see in this yard here, this guy's from Barbados. That's his back wall, and you can see this classic ficus hedge in the back and some arbicola in the front, and these were all installed by the builder. Now, this is important because people don't take out, even if they don't like it particularly, what builders put in. Now, what builders buy are cheap plants, right? And not necessarily the kind of plants that provide the sort of ecosystem services that they could provide. But people do not take them out. What they do is they plant around them and make use of them for the most part. And so people, what's also interesting is these kind of installed plants tell us a lot about you can tell, right, just like any other kind of trend when a house was built because of these installed plants. So we're not putting ficus in as much anymore, so you can kind of date that time period. And then you can see these other kind of hedges, and you know right away, that's like a 1950s house or whatever. Now, this, as I said, this backyard. This guy in the front yard, his front yard's a classic kind of front yard. He's from Barbados. He has flowering plants in there that he puts in because he wants his house to look pretty. And the neighborhood that he lives in has lots of concerns about aesthetics in the yard, and he's in conversation with that. They have a homeowners association. The backyard for him is a different story. He's left the stuff that the builders put in, but then as you can see, he's allowed the backyard to go totally into food production. So big gardens everywhere. And this is really one of these examples of how different people's front and backyards are and what they tell us about cultivation and intentionality and social norms. The percentage of native plants species in South Florida yards is very low, extremely low. But it's interesting where we find them and what they are. Of the 1,500 species we have found so far, only 240 were native species. And that number's off because of a couple of plant nuts who had over 60 species of natives in their yards. So it's actually much lower than that. This means only about 12% of all the plants that we found in our survey were natives in urban Miami. But there's a couple things that are interesting about that. First, the native plants we found in the front yard and the backyard were really different. In the front yard, as well as in the backyard, the majority of all native species we found, and this will surprise you, were in grass, in the turf grass. So we tend to think of turf grass as being the driver of ecological homogenization in cities. In fact, in South Florida at least, it is the site of native species diversity. That's where, because they have so many native weeds in them. And so in South Florida, if you're looking for native plants in the city, it's going to be in the grass primarily. In the front yard, other than grass weeds where we found natives, we would find them in beds usually. And only about half the natives we found in people's beds were intentionally put there or cultivated. And what's super interesting about that is that when you find natives in people's beds, they are always people who found out about native plants through some other way. So they're either a member of a gardening club, or they went to a talk at Fairchild, or they did something like that. And so these kind of educational kind of institutions are actually driving, and the only way, it seems, that regular homeowners have native plants in their yards is right there. And the place they put them is in the front yard beds, because they're trying to signal to all their other neighbors that they know about that and this is important. We don't find them in the backyard. We only find them in these front yard beds. What we find in the backyard are generally native species that people don't even know are native, like a cabbage palm or an oak or something. And it's generally something that was already there. I went over some of this ahead of time already, but so we found about a third more native species in people's backyards. The vast majority of those were all lawn weeds. And it's because, as I suggested before, people really take care of their front yard lawns much more than their backyard lawns, and their backyard lawns tend to be a lot less maintained and therefore a lot more weedy. And as I said, when we did find natives in the backyard, these would be usually palms or things like that that people did not intentionally put in because they were native. A lot of us in anthropology are interested in ecological knowledge and trying to understand how ecological knowledge correlates with things like social class. Certainly we found that in our interviews that we did, this is not surprising. And when I'm talking about ecological knowledge now, I'm really talking, we might better call it like ecosystem ecological knowledge, because there's lots of kinds of ecological knowledge, but here I'm talking about knowledge about local habitats, or knowledge about water supply, or knowledge about ecosystem services. Where we find that kind of it sort of correlates with traditional kind of environmentalism. The people who, just like people who are environmentalists, who have this ecosystem ecological knowledge tend to be white, middle class, or upper middle class. And these are the people who talk about native plants, these are the people who talk about garden clubs, these are the people who are aware of water restrictions, and about other kinds of management policies. They also tend to be people who have a long-term connection to place. So not all, by far, white middle class people have ecosystem ecological knowledge. Generally, it's the people who have a longer connection, who were born or who've been here for a long time. Because South Florida is such a transient place, we have this kind of, many of the white middle class people we interviewed were really disconnected from the landscape. And what we find in this, we could call these kind of domestic migrants who've moved here for jobs or other things like that, or retirement. What they try to do is recreate the landscape where they come from, upstate New York or whatever, here. And when you talk to them in the interviews, they're extremely frustrated, of course. This phenomenon of recreating home where you move is widely, of course, documented in environmental history, right? This is what colonialism really actually is. It's this sort of plants. That's why New Zealand looks like it does in cities. But this recreation of home here in South Florida actually just makes people extremely frustrated, because, you know, people talk about it's chaos, I can't keep the vines back, I turn around and the yard's a mess again. I try to plant tomatoes in summer, you know, and they die. My roses are covered with bugs and fungus, etc. And so you see these lifestyles of really kind of frustration and anxiety about the yard, and people who spend time mainly in the house because of that. On the other hand, so this is what these domestic migrants show, and this is a great example of that. This is a home, and that's Stephen there in the picture, in a really exclusive housing development in a very high-end gated community called Ibis. And this is one of those kind of communities that are very self-enclosed and very amenity-rich, where people, you know, drive around in golf carts. The man we interviewed him, he really valued this place because it's also near a nature preserve, and he felt that it really, really encompassed, and the reason he liked it was because it was so natural. and he felt it was an opportunity for him to be a natural place. And he says in his interview, he says, you walk in here and you know you're somewhere different. He said, you know, these houses in this development aren't cookie cutter houses like the rest of them. It's very different. But
It's a big cookie.
it's a little cookie. But he noted how well manicured the neighborhood was, but he also said at the same time there was still nature here. And by nature, what he was talking about in his interview, when we took a look at it, was he was talking about a man-made waterfall. He was talking about the man-made lakes that are in the neighborhood. We call them, you know, borrow pits, as we call them. He was also talking about this preserve that was outside of the neighborhood, where occasionally deer would come into the neighborhood and wade in bursts because of that. Now, what's really interesting and it really, really illustrates this kind of tension people have about what constitutes nature and where they get these ideas of nature and what they want. And for lots of domestic migrants, what they want is more of a kind of pastoral landscape of the Northeast. And so this guy has one of these lakes, borrow pits behind his house, and it's fenced off, and he gets really upset because it gets weedy. He said it gets really weedy, and he even went out and bought this special kind of lassoing device to try to get the weed, and he throws it over the fence and gets the weeds out. But these weeds, of course, are native water plants. And this interview with him, as well as several others like that, really suggests some of the barriers to thinking about and talking about nature with domestic migrants. But ecological knowledge, of course, comes in many forms. And the other type of migrants here that we live with in our community are people who come from the Caribbean, obviously. And in Miami-Dade County, many of these people are, of course, Cuban. For Cuban Americans, we interviewed many Cuban Americans in this project, and for many Cuban Americans in particular, the backyards are what I would call an exile landscape. And what they plant in backyards, Cuban American households primarily, are a real testament to how domestic space works in the landscape. It's literally the site of food production, but what I want to say is here, I'm using the term food production really, when I use that, it really hides the intensely cultural ways in which fruit trees in particular serve as a bridge for exiles to their homelands. So as an example, this was actually the first interview we did on the project, and it was lovely. This man, Alfonso, is talking to Stephen, who they're talking about the plants in his trees. And he and his wife, they live in a pretty small but a well-maintained house in the southern part of Miami-Dade. Alfonso had been imprisoned in Cuba. He went in prison in Cuba when he was in college, right after Castro came into power. And he stayed in prison for 20 years before he was able to leave. So he and his wife came here to the U.S. This is a very familiar story to lots of us. And when they did leave, and this choice to come to the U.S. was an extremely difficult one because they knew they'd never see their families again. When we talked to him about his yard, and so after he came here, he worked as a delivery person, delivering hotel sheets to different hotels. He's in his 70s now, and he doesn't really love yard work. He never really has liked yard work, but he has an extremely well-maintained yard. What he does like is his fruit trees, and it's a real testament to that kind of connection. The entire backyard, there's not like 3 feet in a pretty small lot that does not have a towering fruit tree in it, and it's crammed with trees from home, mangoes, papayas, sabanilla, mamey, he's got a gnome, cherimoya, and he put everything, he put everything in that yard except for one mango tree that was there and that survived Hurricane Andrew. So most of these trees he's put in since Hurricane Andrew. The other kinds of cultivated plants he has in his yard are Cuban herbs that he grows in huge, beautiful pots. When we were there, just like lots of families, which suggests this kind of domestic landscape continuum, his wife made our entire crew of 10 people homemade mango shakes out of mango she had in her freezer. Certainly, Alfonso's story, exile story, is really typical of Cubans of his generation living in Miami. And his yard is also very typical. And this is so fascinating because you drive around and everyone's front yard looks like everyone else's front yards, but their backyards are really landscapes of home. This is my last slide. So what's interesting about this project for me is that cities seem to come into being really at the parcel scale. They are cultivated at the parcel scale, and that these are spaces that are produced by tree huggers, by environmentalists, by transplanted workers, by people who have moved here for lots of different reasons. And these people manage to create an incredible amount of diversity in their yards, but mainly in their backyards. These practices, though, and this was also clear, and this is the next level of analysis that we need to do on this project, is that these practices of landscape production and creativity really take place within a broader political economy where big box stores are the go-to place for plants, and they're also the go-to place for plant knowledge. We talked a lot about people like, well, if you have a problem, where do you go? How do you find out what to do? And generally speaking, it was from Home Depot and Lowe's and things like that. And these stores are also the places where landscapers get their plants to install. And what we know is that this installation becomes a kind of legacy on the landscape. What we also find out about urban, ecological, and social homogeneity is that it occurs in the front yard and not in the backyard. And where it occurs even more, though, and in specific places are in high-end gated community. This is where we're going to find the most homogeneity, in the front end and the backyard. And that's because, also speaking of the political economy, there are institutional rules in place that force this, and they are also landscaping companies that actually do the work. So, with that said, I just wanted to say that as we think about the city, as we drive around and we think about issues of homogenization, that we may see that on first glance, but that really the backyards are the places where where the city's urban ecology comes into being. Thank you.